Darth Nihilus is called the Lord of Hunger, and every world within his reach went silent before he left it. His voice is a language no one in the galaxy has been able to fully translate. The Force itself goes dark wherever he passes, and everything it was sustaining goes with it. His story begins thousands of years before he existed and ends on a planet already broken before his arrival, because the same disaster that shattered that world is also what made him. What turned an unnamed soldier into the most consuming force in the galaxy had ever produced started with a single exiled Jedi, a code she wrote that the entire Dark Tradition would recite for the rest of history, and a war that would break everyone who fought it. Chapter 1. The Wound. Darth Nihilus was made at Malachor V, and the weapon that made him killed everyone else in the system. The Mandalorian Wars had torn through the outer reaches of the Republic for 16 years. The Mandalorian clans were a warrior culture pressing inward from the edges of known space, burning worlds and advancing in ways the Republic's military could not answer. When the Jedi Council refused to intervene, a knight named Revan raised his own banner and led thousands of Jedi into the fight. Among those who followed him were Meetra Surik, one of the most trusted commanders, and a Zabrak engineer named Bao-Dur, who was quietly designing a weapon whose full purpose even his colleagues did not understand. Revan himself had been trained years earlier by a Jedi Master named Kreia, whose teachings the Council would later blame for everything he became. One more person entered that war, and no record has preserved their name. This person was Force-sensitive, present in the Malachor system when the final engagement took place, and did not survive that day as themselves. Revan won the war and then disappeared. His departure left a power vacuum across the Republic and the Jedi Order, while the consequences of Malachor V continued to spread. Bao-Dur's weapon was the mass shadow generator. It would collapse the gravitational stability of the Malachor system, dragging everything inside it towards the center. He had aimed it at the system itself, with both fleets still inside. Meetra Surik gave the order to activate it. The Mandalorian and Republic fleets were wiped out together in the collapse, and the planet Malachor V was reduced to a shattered, poison ruin. The losses on both sides ran into the millions. Every Force sensitive at the edge of that collapse felt each death in real time. The Force is a living network connecting every being within it, and when millions of lives end at once inside a system soaked in corrupting energy, the network does not absorb the loss, it tears. Meetra Surik survived, but surviving it cost her everything she had been. She cut herself off from the Force, completely and deliberately, with an act of will so total that what remained in her place was a Jedi-shaped absence in the fabric of the Force. A severance that complete leaves something behind, a wound, a gap in the living network where a Jedi used to be. The Jedi Council eventually called her back, exiled from the Order, and sent her into the Outer Rim. A Force wound is an injury to the Force itself, produced when enough violence is committed against living beings while the corrupting influence is running deep. The Force can be torn, and the location of the tear draws other Force-sensitive towards it the way a crack in a wall pulls the eye, because absence has its own gravity. Malachor V produced two wounds from the same event, and they moved in opposite directions. Meetra Surik was the wound that echoes. She had removed herself from the Force, and the space she had occupied became a gap the Force kept attempting to fill through the people around her. At the heart of the collapse, the Force surged towards the wound the weapon had torn, a concentration of dark power directed at sealing what had just been broken. That surge needed a host, and it found one. The unnamed soldier was at the center of the collapse. He had been part of Revan's army, one of thousands positioned at Malachor for the final engagement, close enough to the surface that the mass shadow generator's effects reached him before he had time to understand what was happening. The Force's attempt to seal itself used him as the vehicle. He would have felt everything around him dying at once, millions of lives ending in a single wave of silence, and then the Force rushing into him to fill the gap those lives had left. The rush did not stop. It consumed him from the inside, replacing everything he was with the hunger that would define everything he would become. The Force consumed the man it used to seal the wound and left something else behind. Nothing like it had existed before. What emerged from Malachor was a new kind of being, created by the disaster itself. The being that walked out of Malachor had no face and no name. Both had been consumed when the wound overtook its host, leaving only robes to hold the shape of a man who no longer existed. What filled that shape was hunger, constant and growing, expanding into a galaxy that had nothing large enough to satisfy it. If anything remained of the man's awareness, it would have known only one thing: The hunger was no longer something he felt. It was what he had become. The legend sourcebook, known as the Campaign Guide, maps the mechanics behind it. 2 wounds, identical in origin and opposite in nature, the unnamed soldier had become a hunger the Force could never satisfy. Meetra Surik had become its opposite. They were moving in different directions now, but the galaxy is not large enough to keep 2 halves of the same wound apart forever. Nihilus drifted across the ruined surface of Malachor V in the days after the collapse. The planet's surface had been compressed and fractured by the mass shadow generator, and the wreckage of both fleets was embedded in the terrain like debris frozen in a flood. He moved through it without purpose, drawn from one fading signature to the next, consuming whatever residual Force energy the dead had left behind. The first feedings were small. They sustained him long enough to move farther from the epicenter, and each one established the pattern that would define the rest of his existence. Consume, move, hunger again, consume again. By the time he left Malachor, the pattern was already accelerating. The Sith had a language for what Nihilus became long before he existed. Nearly 7,000 years earlier, an exiled Jedi named Sorza's Sin had recorded the Sith Code, 6 lines that promised freedom through the dark side. Nihilus would become the closest thing in Sith history to that promise, taken to its limit. What left Malachor was not a survivor, but the wound itself, still wearing the shape of the man it had consumed. Chapter 2. The Diagnosis. While the hunger grew in the dark, a former Jedi Master walked through the same wreckage and became something else entirely. Kreia had been expelled from the Jedi Order after Revan's fall, blamed for teaching her students to think in ways that made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of corruption Revan had embraced. After her expulsion, she had drifted towards darker knowledge, and eventually she traveled to Malachor V, drawn towards the lingering Force echoes of the disaster. What touched her there changed her. She took the name Darth Traya, claimed the ancient Trayus Academy as her seat of power, and began assembling what she called a new order. She needed students who were already proof that the Force destroys the people who serve it. She found Nihilus on Malachor, or what was left of him, and she recognized immediately what the Force had produced. Kreia was not looking for ordinary apprentices. She sought people whose lives had been shaped by the worst consequences of the Force. Sion was one of them. His body had been broken during the Great Sith War, the conflict that had ended with the fall of Exar Kun roughly 45 years earlier. Every wound that should have killed him remained suspended by the dark side. His anguish held his body together, and the refusal to stop hurting was the only thing keeping him alive. Where Nihilus had been hollowed out by the Force's attempt to seal itself, Sion had been shattered and refused to let the pieces fall. 2 different wounds from the same war. 2 different ways the dark side could keep something alive that had no business surviving. Nihilus represented something different. Malachor had transformed him into a being sustained by endless hunger. He was no longer fed to gain power or pursue an ambition. He fed because he could not survive any other way. When Kreia first encountered him, she would have seen a figure that barely registered as alive, robes holding the shape of a man whose face had been consumed, speaking in a language that even she, with all her mastery, could not fully decode. She recognized what the Force had produced at Malachor, and she understood that Nihilus was the most dangerous evidence she would ever find. Kreia eventually saw her own life as part of the same pattern. The Jedi Order had cast her out for her teachings. The Dark Tradition would eventually reject her for many of those same ideas. While those beliefs were taking shape, the surviving Jedi were disappearing across the Republic. Sion hunted them directly, tracking isolated masters and enclaves that had survived the chaos following the Jedi Civil War. Nihilus operated on a larger scale, draining entire gatherings when his hunger found them. The campaign unfolded slowly enough that the Republic never fully grasped what was happening. Jedi simply disappeared, one by one, or in clusters, and by the time the process neared its end, only a handful remained. On the ice world of Telos, as the Legends video game Knights of the Old Republic 2 opens, a Jedi historian named Atris had built herself a hidden archive filled with forbidden holocrons, telling herself she was preserving dangerous knowledge before the Purge consumed it entirely. She had been one of the masters who voted to exile Meetra Surik after Malachor V. What she was reading in those archives was already changing her, though she did not yet know it. She had already begun to consider whether the only way to draw the threat into the open was to offer it something it could not resist. Then, Kreia's own apprentices turned on her. Sion and Nihilus, working together at the Trayus Academy, stripped her of the Force and cast her out. It was her second exile in a single lifetime. The first had come from the Jedi. This one came from the 2 apprentices she had recruited to prove that the Force betrays its servants. Whether she had expected that betrayal or not, her conflict with Sion and Nihilus was now personal. She was hunting them both now, and the largest meal left was still moving through the dark in a hollow man's robes. Chapter 3. The Hunger. The hunger was still manageable, and Nihilus could feed without drawing the attention that later followed him. Between Malachor and Katarr, Nihilus could still be directed. He hunted and fed at intervals that kept his condition from collapsing on itself, targeting Force-sensitive individuals and small groups whose locations happened to align with the Triumvirate's purposes. Between feedings, he drifted aboard the ship he had raised from Malachor's orbit, a presence that registered to the crew as pressure rather than command. He did not issue orders in any language they understood. The ship moved because the hunger moved, and the crew followed because they no longer had the will to do otherwise. He moved towards targets not from obedience, but because the hunger and Kreia's goals pointed in the same direction, making him an asset she could deploy with some confidence that the result would be useful. The worlds and enclaves he drained during this period left no survivors and generated no explanations the Republic could act on. The isolated Jedi disappeared. Remote settlements went dark. Sensor readings from the affected sectors showed nothing unusual because the hunger left no physical evidence, only silence where life had been. Even in this early phase, the hunger selected targets, directed agents, and maintained a fleet with precision. It remains unclear whether those decisions belonged to a remnant of the man or to the hunger using his shape. Each feeding increased the amount of Force energy Nihilus required to sustain himself. The intervals between feedings shortened. Where months had once passed between one consumption and the next, weeks began to collapse into days. The hunger did not announce itself gradually. It arrived fully formed, the same overwhelming demand every time, and the only thing that changed was how quickly it returned after being temporarily silenced. Nihilus had no way to measure this acceleration from inside. Awareness of decline requires a self that can observe its own condition, and whatever remained of Nihilus's self had long since been folded into the appetite. Nihilus was no longer moving towards a goal, only towards the next hunger. The galaxy did not yet understand that what it was facing could not be fought, only outlasted, and only then by someone made of the right kind of absence. Every conventional response the Republic might have mounted would have fed him rather than stopped him. Later generations of Sith scholars would try to classify what Nihilus did as a learnable technique, a dark side power called Force Drain that could be studied and replicated. They were wrong. What the Force had done to him at Malachor could not be taught any more than a wound can be inherited by someone who was never cut. Katarr marked a turning point in Nihilus's hunger. The Miraluka colony world sat at the edge of known space, a planet where every living person perceived the world entirely through the Force rather than through sight. The Miraluka had evolved without functional eyes. Their entire civilization was built on Force perception from birth. Consuming them destroyed not just their lives, but the very sense through which they experience existence. No other world in the galaxy had this kind of Force density among its entire population. The timing made it worse. A gathering of Jedi Masters had convened on Katarr in secret, hoping to discuss the growing threat in the safety of a world the Republic had largely forgotten. Atris had called that gathering. She'd also leaked its location, believing it could serve as bait to draw the Sith threat into the open. The gamble killed every Jedi Master who attended. Nihilus arrived above Katarr with a hunger that had already risen well past the point of ordinary prey. The event plays out in the Legends comic anthology Star Wars Tales from Visas Marr's perspective. A young Miraluka watching the sky change, then feeling the Force go dark across the entire planet, then hearing every person she had ever known go silent at once. The silence was total, and Nihilus consumed the entire population of Katarr in the span of a single afternoon. He came out of Katarr hungrier than he entered. The meal had not satisfied him. It permanently raised its tolerance past anything the galaxy's remaining Force-sensitive life could match. An entire world of Force-sensitive beings consumed in one feeding, and the hunger had barely paused before it started asking for more. The Republic received scattered reports of a colony world gone silent. No investigation found survivors. No explanation was offered. The galaxy moved on because the galaxy did not yet understand what was feeding on it. One person had survived Katarr, and what Nihilus did with that survivor would determine everything. Visas Marr was a Meetra civilian who had been present during the destruction and had not perished with the rest of her species. Nihilus recovered her from the empty world, the only living thing left on a planet that had held millions that morning, and brought her aboard his ship. The bond he formed with her was unlike anything the master-apprentice tradition had produced before. The Meetra perceived through the Force, which meant Visas's foresight was a precise instrument tuned to exactly the kind of perception Nihilus, having consumed his own face and the senses that once came with it, could no longer access on his own. Through Visas, shapes and distances returned. For the first time since Malachor, the galaxy became more than a field of prey. He made her his apprentice and deployed her as his eyes in the galaxy while he remained aboard the ship, drifting further from whatever he had once been. In most Force bonds, strength flows one direction, the master drawing from the apprentice. The bond between Nihilus and Visas ran both ways, and that made her his last remaining connection to anything resembling a self. Without her, there was no way to reach whatever remained of the person inside the absence. None of that was visible yet. What was visible was a galaxy with one fewer world, a hunger that had risen past the available supply, and a single surviving Meetra moving through the dark on her master's orders towards a target he had begun to understand was the only meal he had left. Katarr had elevated his hunger past anything the galaxy could satisfy, except one thing, and that one thing had no idea he was coming. Chapter 4. The Verdict. The Ravager carried Nihilus through the galaxy the way a corpse carries a disease, and it was failing on the same schedule he was. The ship was an Interdictor-class cruiser that had served the Republic Navy during the Mandalorian conflict and had been wrecked at Malachor V during the final engagement, torn apart and then compressed by the mass shadow generator's gravitational collapse. It drifted in Malachor's orbit as wreckage for years afterward, but Nihilus reached out through the Force and raised it back into something resembling a function. The act itself was an expression of hunger. He did not repair the ship. He held it together the same way the dark side held Sion together, through sheer Force-sustained refusal to let it collapse. By the time the exile finds it, the ship has been altered by years of closeness to Nihilus's presence in ways that conventional engineering has no language for. The hull is corrupted at the material level by the Force itself. Years of exposure to Nihilus have soaked the metal with dark energy, warping sections and fusing components in ways that should not be possible. Entire decks have been sealed because the decay has made them impassable, and the remaining corridors twist through the ship's interior like the passages of something organic rather than engineered. The campaign guide makes the Ravager's nature clear. This is a darkside artifact at battlecruiser scale, and it is doing to its environment what Nihilus does to everything in his reach, draining the life out of whatever is near it. The figures aboard the Ravager are not soldiers in any useful sense. They were gathered by Nihilus after he raised the ship, Force sensitives and non-Force sensitives drawn into service aboard a vessel that has been draining them since the day they arrived. They occupy stations and move through corridors, but do not eat, sleep, or communicate in any recognizable way. They are the residue of people the process has not yet finished, animated by just enough remaining Force energy to stay technically alive, while every other feature of being alive slowly drains from them. Colonel Tobin had no Force sensitivity at all, and the Ravager was consuming him anyway. Tobin was an Onderonian military officer, second in command to General Vaklu, who had allied with the Sith during the Onderonian Civil War. Nihilus's fleet had supported Vaklu's attempted coup on Onderon, and when that alliance collapsed, Tobin was pulled aboard as part of the arrangement. He had no Jedi training, no connection to any Force tradition, no alignment with the darker path. He had simply been in the wrong alliance at the wrong time, and the ship did not care about the intent. By the time the exile finds him, he is visibly diminished. The steady drain that has been reducing the crew to barely living husks is operating on him as well, more slowly because there is less Force energy to draw on, but steadily and without any apparent limit. Nihilus's hunger reaches beyond Force sensitives. It'll take anyone. The mask does not hide a face. It marks where a face used to be. The design team kept stripping facial features from early materials until what remained was not a face concealed, but an absence confirmed. Nihilus spent years aboard the Ravager in this state, a presence that grew weaker as the hunger grew louder. He did not command the ship in any recognizable way. He inhabited it the way a fever inhabits a body, present everywhere and directed by no one. His voice completes the absence. He speaks only in a corrupted dialect that no one around him can fully translate, not even Visas, who is bonded to him more deeply than any master-apprentice bond in the tradition's recorded history. His speech may be more than a broken language. It may be the raw, untranslated voice of the Force itself, the layer that exists beneath the system that normally turns Force communication into something minds can process. Either way, the dark tradition passes itself down through speech, and his has degraded past the ability to carry it. Between feedings, Nihilus remained aboard the Ravager while the fleet followed the movements of his hunger. The crew continued their duties without understanding them, and the ships moved wherever the next concentration of Force presence drew his attention. Nihilus did not come to Telos for conquest. He came because he was starving. The Telos Restoration Project was rebuilding a planet devastated during the Jedi Civil War, producing concentrated regenerating life at a rate no other available world was producing it. Telos had no military value. Nihilus was drawn to it because it held the densest concentration of living Force presence within his reach, and he had already exhausted every other source. Visas was dispatched ahead of the assault. Her stated mission was the retrieval or removal of a Force user moving through the Republic. Nihilus was using her as a sensor. He had detected a presence unlike anything he had encountered before, a wound that generated Force rather than containing it, and he needed to know if it was real before moving toward it as a meal. The exile came for him at Telos. By then, Nihilus's hunger had consumed more of him than he had consumed of the galaxy. The robes were growing thinner. The presence aboard the ship had thinned to almost nothing, and the crew around him had been drained past the point of awareness. He was eating himself alive, and the only meal that could slow the collapse was the one walking towards him. Nihilus would have sensed her long before she boarded. The exile's wound in the Force was unlike anything else in the galaxy, a gap that generated Force rather than containing it, and to Nihilus, that gap would have felt like the largest concentration of energy he had ever encountered. He moved towards it the way he had moved towards Katarr, automatically and without calculation. He did not understand that this meal was the one thing in the galaxy his hunger could not consume. Hunger had never failed before, and it had no way of recognizing what failure would look like. The exile did not board the Ravager to fight. She boarded it to end him. Visas Marr had chosen to sever her bond with Nihilus and bind it to the exile instead, the sole survivor of Katarr, rejecting the master who had consumed her world. The act cut the last thread of personhood Nihilus still retained. The bond had been the only channel through which whatever remained of the man inside the absence could still be addressed. Once it was redirected, that channel closed. Colonel Tobin, persuaded by the exile to recognize what Nihilus had done to him aboard the ship, helped the Mandalorian strike team plant proton charges at the Ravager's weak points on the way to the bridge. Bao-Dur was not on that bridge, but the assault was the final consequence of the weapon he had built and the order the two of them had carried out together at Malachor V. The wound that consumes cannot consume the wound that echoes. Nihilus's hunger flowed into the exile and found nothing it could consume. Unlike every other being he had encountered since Malachor, the exile offered no reservoir of Force presence to drain. For the first time, the hunger failed. When Nihilus fell, what hit the deck was not a body, it was robes and a mask. The fabric settled flat against the floor with nothing inside it to hold its shape. The mask landed face down. The man who had once worn them had been gone for years, and the hunger that replaced him had finally burned through the last of what used to exist. The proton charges detonated on the way out. The Ravager broke apart in Telos space, the wreckage of a ship that was already a ruin, completing the collapse the mass shadow generator had started decades earlier. Whatever had been sustaining the crew dissolved with Nihilus. The figures at their stations, the barely living husks that had been running the ship's systems, stopped moving when the hunger that had been holding them in place released its grip. The ship and its crew ended up together, a single organism that had been dying since the day Nihilus raised it from Malachor's orbit. For the first time since Malachor, the hunger stopped. The silence it left behind was total. The galaxy did not notice. It had never known what was feeding on it. In 8,000 years, Bane would come, and Sidious, and Vader, and none of them would ever read the code as far as Nihilus. Every Dark Lord in history recited the code and stopped somewhere short of its end. They held on to ambition, or attachment, or legacy. Nihilus held on to nothing, because the Force had already taken everything. The code promised that through passion, a practitioner would find strength. Through strength, they would find power. And through victory, their chains would be broken. So was everything else. He's a verdict on what the Sith Code produces when no one stops short of the end. Most who recited it held on to something. Ambition, attachment, legacy. Nihilus had nothing left to hold. Quick note before you go, members get early access and a few videos that stay off the main channel. If that's interesting, the link is in the description. Otherwise, here's another video you might like.